Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be doing something new that I've never done on this channel before. We're going to be doing a thrift flip, and I'm really excited about this because when I first got into sewing, the types of videos that really got me interested in learning how to sew were thrift flip videos. At the time, I didn't have a lot of extra money to spend on new clothes because I was a student, so I loved going to the thrift store to find a lot of my clothes. And so the idea that I could take something at the thrift store and change it into something a little bit more my style, a little bit more cool and modern, was just really inspiring to me. However, I will be really honest in saying that I've tried to do a couple of thrift flips in the past, and the results were not ideal. I think I tried to do these thrift flips too early on in my sewing career when I didn't really have the skills needed to work with fabric. I wasn't so experienced at things like finding the grain line of a fabric, fitting, adding things like zippers, buttons, taking things in and out. So I was really unsuccessful in the past, and that's made me a little bit nervous to try thrift flips up until now. But today we're breaking that streak, and I'm going to be doing a thrift flip of this dress, which I thrifted many years ago from a thrift store in Victoria, BC, Canada when I was a student. And as you can see, this is a really cool late 90s, early 2000s dress. It's made of this gorgeous flowy rayon, and I absolutely love this fabric. And this is one of the reasons I've been a little bit nervous to thrift flip this dress, because I will be really mad at myself if my creation doesn't turn out well, because it will be such a waste of this gorgeous fabric. I feel like this drapey rayon is the type of rayon that's really hard to find these days. It's got a really vintage feel to it. It's almost like a crepe, and you can see it's a black background with red roses on it, and it's just a really timeless, subtle pattern that I think would look great in a variety of silhouettes. The reason I do want to thrift flip this dress is because it doesn't fit me very well. It's several sizes too big for me. I have taken it in the past, but also the hems of the sleeves and the skirt are just fraying and unraveling. And I don't think the silhouette does a lot for me, particularly the top. So I think it would be a good candidate to turn into something new because there's a lot of fabric there to work with. Now, some people who like to flip their thrifted finds will do so without using a pattern or anything, but I really thought that this dress would look so great as the Bella Loves Patterns Chloe dress. I'll put a picture up for you now, but I want to try transforming this dress into this Bella Loves Patterns Chloe dress because there's a lot of details in this I really like. I like the gathering at the bust, and I really like the tie sleeves, and I think it's cool that it comes in two different lengths as well. And it's just a really gorgeous silhouette. It almost reminds me of something you would see at Reformation. So I thought we should try giving it a go at transforming my thrift store dress into this gorgeous dress. So if you're interested in seeing the process, please do follow along and let me know what you think at the end of the video. All right, let's get into it. So the first thing I did to start off this project was to take the original dress apart. I seam ripped the entire dress to keep as much of the original fabric intact as possible. And once I had seam ripped the dress and I had all the pieces of the original dress, I took my pattern pieces and I spent some time playing around with all of them, placing them on the pieces of fabric and just seeing what would be the best fit. I was trying to optimize the fabric that I had, and once I had that sorted out, I went ahead and I started cutting out my pattern pieces from the original pieces of the dress. I was trying my best to cut out the pattern pieces along the proper grain line of the fabric, but it was a little bit challenging to do because it was hard to find the grain line of the fabric pieces. I didn't have quite enough fabric to make the long tie strap, so I ended up piecing a couple of smaller rectangles together to make a couple of the straps. And then I carefully marked my pattern pieces, including the darts I would need to sew later. I also needed to cut out some lining pieces, so I interfaced the lining fabric, which was a lightweight rayon, and then I cut these pieces out as well. Rather than having true darts, this pattern has sort of open darts on the lining pieces, so I cut the triangles out of this area. Before I got started with the actual sewing, I set up my sewing machine with black thread and played around with the tension and stitch length until I got a result I was happy with. So first I'm sewing these kind of open darts closed. I'm not sure the proper name for these, but they're kind of like a dart, except there's no excess fabric in the middle. So I just placed the triangle right sides together and sewed with the proper seam allowance. Once I had my dart sewn in the lining pieces, I sewed the front lining cups right sides together and pressed that seam open. So then I sewed the front bust lining piece to the upper back bodice lining at the side seams. I finished the seams and pressed them open. Then I stitched a basting stitch along the bottom of this lining piece at about 1.5 centimeters from the edge, and this will help us later when we need to attach the lining to the bodice. Next, I grabbed the front bust pieces and started sewing my gathering stitches, and I sewed 3 rows of gathering stitches along the edge of the center front of both of these pieces, and I gathered them until they're the same width as the front bust lining that we already finished. When this was done, I sewed the front bust pieces right sides together, making sure that my gathered stitches still looked neat and tidy. I pressed the seam open, and then I got the bust tie piece and pressed it as per the pattern instructions. And then you're supposed to place the bust tie on the front bust at the center front seam, and you just sort of loosely tack it in place because at a later step it's going to get caught in the seam allowance. But I forgot to show this step on camera. So next I grabbed the front bodice piece and attached it to the front side bodice pieces, right sides together, finished the seam allowances and pressed it to one side. Then we've got the upper front bust piece and then the lower front bodice piece, and we need to attach them right sides together. And go slowly at this part. I recommend to pin carefully because you're attaching a concave curve to a convex curve, which is always tricky. So just make sure to ease in slowly so that you don't get any gathers or wrinkles. Next, we're pinning the back bodice to the back side bodice and stitching right sides together. Once this is done, stitch this piece to the upper back bodice, right sides together, and press the seam upwards. You'll have one of these for either side of the front bodice. So then we need to pin and sew the front and back bodice pieces right sides together along the side seams, and then press the seams either open or to one side. Then it was time to make the straps. Like I mentioned earlier, I had to piece a couple of rectangular pieces together to make my strap, so I just sewed them right sides together, finished the seam and pressed it to one side so I had a longer rectangle. And then I folded the right rectangle right sides together and sewed along the open edge. I sewed either of the short ends closed, and I left a small section open in the middle of the length of the tie so that I could turn it right sides out, and then I edge stitched this together afterwards. At this point, it was time to pin the strap in each place, so you should have marked from your pattern where the strap should roughly go, so you can pin it there and then just loosely baste it on so that it's ready to go for a later step. And here you'll see I'm just remarking my darts because they had worn away by the time I went to sew them on the skirt pieces. So then I pinned my dart carefully using the line I marked. So then I stitched the dart right sides together, being careful to get as close to the end of the dart as I could, and I pressed the dart towards the center back. Then I attached the side front skirt to the center front skirt pieces right sides together and finished the seam and pressed it to one side. And then I sewed the front and back skirts together at each side seam, finished the seams and pressed the seam to one side. You could also press the seam open if you'd like. I opted not to include pockets because I knew that this lightweight fabric wouldn't be a good choice for pockets and that it would kind of drag one side of the dress down, so I just skipped that. So then I moved right onto the step where we're attaching the bodice of the dress to the skirt portion along the waist seam. And take care to match all of the seams and notches provided. This pattern has a lot of different seams and ideally they should line up from the skirt to the bodice, so just take your time there. You could baste first and then stitch a tighter row of stitches once you're satisfied with the placement. Finish the seam and press the seam downwards. Okay, so next it was time to do the invisible zipper. So one thing I did throughout this process is I carefully marked all of the seams along the back bodice on both sides of the zipper to make sure that I could line up the same section of the zipper with each seam on each side, which would result in a neat finish. And then I used my invisible zipper foot to stitch as close as possible to the zipper teeth to get a nice neat finish. Once I was satisfied with the zipper, I went ahead and pinned the bodice lining right sides together to the bodice along the top edge. Make sure that your straps are facing downwards or towards the inside of the dress at this point. You don't want them to kind of get caught in the seam other than where they actually attach to the dress. So then you can go ahead and stitch these pieces together along the top neckline section. So I cut off a lot of the extra seam allowance here, carefully I might add, and then I spent some time clipping and notching my curved seams. This will help to make sure that when you fold over the bodice lining to the inside, you still get a nice finish. And it will help it to lie as flat as possible. But before we do press it to the inside, we're going to understitch the lining to the seam allowance to help prevent the lining from flipping outwards when you wear the dress. Then I pressed the bottom of the bodice lining under at about 1.5 centimeters using that guide basting stitch that we had made earlier. And then it was time to either hand stitch or machine stitch the lining to the dress. I opted to machine stitch using a stitch in the ditch technique to catch my lining, but you could also hand stitch for a nice neat finish. I'm just not that skilled at hand stitching, so I decided to go to the machine for that part. And then the pattern maker suggests that you hand stitch the center front gathering on the bust to the bust lining underneath where the tie is, and make sure that you're not catching the bust tie when you do this hand stitching. Lastly, I'm sewing up the bottom of the skirt back seam underneath where the zipper finishes. I just left this step for last, so I'm just closing it up there. So last but not least, the dress needed a hem, so I let it hang for about 24 hours. And then when I was satisfied with the hem, I just did a simple double fold hem using a very small seam allowance of about 0.5 centimeters each time. I pressed it using an iron, and then I stitched the hem on the sewing machine. And with that, the dress is done and we're all ready for the reveal. Okay guys, so this is the reveal of my thrifted transformation dress, and I'm so happy with how this dress turned out. So to start off, let's talk about the pattern. I think this is a really nice pattern, and I got a great fit from this right out the gate with no modifications. I didn't make a mock-up or anything like that, and I'm really happy with the fit in the bodice overall. I will say there's a lot of little pieces in this bodice, so it's pretty fussy to make. You want to be really careful that you're lining up your seam allowances perfectly, otherwise things will become a little bit off. So just look out for that. And if you wanted to be sure about the fit, then you could make up a mock-up as well. I also really like that the bust and upper back are lined, so you can see there's this nice lining fabric inside, which just makes the dress feel so much more finished and high quality. I really wanted to go for these bow sleeves. There is a version of this dress that doesn't have the bows, so I really stretched my fabric to the max to make these bow sleeves. I had to piece a few different strips of fabric together, but once it's all done, you wouldn't really notice that, so I'm glad I went for the bow sleeves because I was really excited about that detail. In terms of the length of the dress, I made the dress as long as I could using the fabric that I had. So I lengthened a lot of the pattern pieces as long as I could using the panels from the original skirt of the dress. So the length is a little bit longer than the mini dress. If I had had a lot of fabric, I would have preferred to make this a midi length, but I was just working with what I had. So basically what I did is I traced the pattern for the skirt and I lengthened the mini dress pieces as much as I could using the available fabric I had from my other dress. And overall, I'm happy with the length. It's not too short, so I think I'll actually get a lot of wear out of it because I don't typically wear dresses that are too short. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the shortcomings of this dress. The first thing I noticed is that because I was using fabric from the pre-existing garment, some of the pieces are not cut perfectly on the grain. I did try to do my best to line up the grain line of the pieces of fabric with the grain line of the pattern pieces, but in some cases it was challenging. And I think at least one or two of the skirt pieces are slightly off grain. So it does mean that the skirt doesn't drape perfectly. Now this is a minor detail and it's not going to prevent me from wearing this dress, but I do think for me, at the level of sewing that I'm at, it's a mistake that I would ideally not like to happen in the future. So I'm going to keep this in mind when I do my future thrift flip. I was also kind of surprised at how hard it was to fit the pattern pieces on the fabric that I had once I deconstructed the dress. The original dress was too big for me. It was quite long, so I thought I'd have a lot of extra fabric to work with, especially when making a much shorter and kind of skimpier dress, but I really did have to piece almost every single scrap of the dress to make this dress. So in the future, I may be more inclined to transform a thrifted piece without using a pattern rather than trying to make a thrifted piece fit into a sewing pattern perfectly, because I think unless you're working with something that's much too large for you and has a ton of extra fabric, it's just really hard to do that and get everything cut on the grain. A couple more things I don't love about the pattern. I find the bust gathering at the front was pretty finicky, and the instructions for the gathering weren't ideal. The instructions basically said gather the front piece until it matches the length of the lining piece, but this left some room for ambiguity for me. I wish they had been more specific about how long to gather it. I had to go back in several times and kind of redistribute the gathers to make them sit nicely. I'm still not perfectly happy with the gathers, but since there's that tie in the center front of the dress, it does kind of hide that area. And I think the overall look is pretty good in the end. A couple other thoughts about this. The straps I didn't add any interfacing or lining to, I just used the lightweight rayon of the dress, and I've noticed they do really stretch out and give as I'm wearing the dress, which means it then starts to fall down. So if I could go back and do it again, I would add some sort of lightweight interfacing or an extra layer to my straps just so they wouldn't stretch as much, so that they'd actually do their job and hold the dress up. But it does stay up pretty well on its own even without that. And then in terms of styling this dress, I mean, it's kind of an all-in-one outfit. But what I think is really nice about it is I think this could be an event dress. Like if you had a more casual or beachy wedding, I think you could totally wear this type of dress to a wedding. But I think dressed down with maybe some sneakers and some casual accessories, you could definitely wear this to dinner as well, which I really appreciate having that versatility. But for me, this will be like a nice going out dress. I don't think I'll wear this kind of day to day, but if I have a nice dinner in the summer, maybe I'm sitting on a patio, sipping on some nice drinks, then I could picture myself wearing something like this and feeling really chic and really cool. Okay, so recently on Instagram, I've been seeing more and more people break down the cost of making their sewing projects. And I think this is a great idea because it will help you guys understand how much I spend when I make a project, and it will also help me keep track of how much money I'm spending when I'm sewing, which I think is really useful information to have. So for today's project, the fabric was pretty inexpensive because I got it as a thrifted dress at the thrift store. And I also didn't use a lot of interfacing or lining fabric, so that wasn't a big expense for this project either. I had some thread and a zipper in my stash that I had got for a pretty inexpensive price, and I only used about a half a spool of thread. So the total cost I estimated to make this project was about $39. And in terms of the time it took me to sew it, this project took a little bit longer because I spent so long seam ripping the original thrifted dress apart. So that contributed a lot of extra time to the project. I also find I'm just a little bit slower at sewing compared to some other people, and when I'm filming every step of the sewing process, it can take a bit longer as well. So I think if you wanted to make this dress, it probably wouldn't take you quite this long if you weren't seam ripping a garment apart. And then finally, my thoughts about the thrift transformation process. I had a lot of fun transforming the dress. I was a little bit worried about cutting into such a beautiful dress and a beautiful garment, but I think overall I pulled it off despite the slight flaws I see in the finished dress. I do feel at peace because I don't feel like I ruined the original garment, which is great. Moving forward, do I think I'll do more thrift flips in the future? I think I will, but I think I'm going to be pretty picky about what I transform. I'm a pretty big fabric snob. I run really hot, so if I wear anything with polyester or viscose, I just get really sweaty and uncomfortable. So I think I'd have to find the right fabric, the right garment at the thrift store to make me want to transform it. I don't think I'm going to be transforming things just for the sake of it, because I don't think in the end I'll end up wearing them very often unless I like the fabric enough. And I find at my local thrift stores these days, they're really trying to put modern brands on the shelves. So I see a lot of H&M, I see a lot of Zara, but I don't see a lot of true vintage garments or maybe higher end things on the shelves. So I find it hard to find items that I would be interested in buying and transforming. But that's just my thoughts. Please let me know what you thought of this transformation down below. Do you like the finished version of the dress, or did you like the original dress better? Let me know, you won't hurt my feelings. And also let me know if you like to transform thrifted items. Maybe give me some ideas for a future video. I would appreciate that. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video today. I'm really happy to have you here. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this type of video, please subscribe down below. I would love to have you here on my channel. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.